was through me, I guess is the best way to describe it. And it wasn't me as a persona, but it would be what I would consider maybe a higher self, a broader perspective of me. And it said, it's not going to be a bad death. Just give it about 30 seconds and it'll all be over. I felt completely peaceful, totally tranquil. I had no more terror, no more fear. I wasn't upset about the fact that I was going to die. I was completely, totally at peace, but not just a relaxed peace, like a profound. My first NDE was drowning or a near drowning. And it happened, I got caught in a riptide. So I was going out for a swim. It was my last day on this little island that I was visiting with my sister. And this area was known actually for really deadly riptides. And I thought that I was kind of staying in a safe zone. And the next thing I knew, I was being literally ripped from the shore. And I got taken out to the last wave break really quickly. And of course, some panic set in, and I started to really fight to try to find my way somehow out of this channel of water. And as I began to fight, I could tell that this was an extraordinarily fierce riptide. And I got myself kind of back about waist deep, and I got one foot kind of dug in this. That's when real panic and terror set in, because I realized then that I was in real trouble, that it was quite a serious situation. I was really fit, and it's probably, thank goodness, or might not have done as well as it did, but I started to hyperventilate. I was fighting so hard, and there was so much terror at that point that I was really, really not in good shape. And then right at that moment when I realized, like, I can't make it out of this. I'm just, it's no way. I'm physically defeated, and I'm, way out in the ocean at this point. And a voice arose through me, I guess is the best way to describe it. And it wasn't me as a persona, but it would be what I would consider maybe a higher self, a broader perspective of me. And it said, it's not going to be a bad death. Just give it about 30 seconds and it'll all be over. I felt completely peaceful, totally tranquil. I had no more terror, no more fear. I wasn't upset about the fact that I was going to die. I was completely, totally at peace, but not just a relaxed peace, like a profound peace. It was definitely a state of being that was quite expanded, quite different from my normal state, in particular there in the water, but definitely felt very profound. And then as I was hearing this voice and feeling this incredibly profound state and essentially accepting my death with no fight, no problems, I didn't feel the urge to try to fight anymore. It was just this very neutral feeling. And it seems like everything went black, but it didn't tunnel vision when black. It was just, there's just nothing there. And then suddenly I'm aware again, standing knee deep in the water facing the shore. So I can speculate about a few ways I might have gotten there, but I really have no idea how I was just suddenly standing in the water looking at the shore again. And I realized in that moment that I still have this very profound feeling of peace and tranquility and also love. But it's a love that I know a lot of NDE experiences talk about this. It's just something that can't you describe to our psyches or our personas here. We have separation. We're in this paradigm separation, and it's something so complete and holistic and ubiquitous that words can't really describe it, but it was profound. And again, this voice arose through me that said, loves me. And it was it was everyone, not just encompassing humanity, but the sense was all aliveness, all living beings, all sentience. And it was totally ubiquitous. For as much love as I was receiving, I was somehow giving. And it was just the most incredible experience. And I also noticed that it was kind of a jungle area where I was swimming. And it was already, but everything just looked so magically beautiful. And I'm still, though, hyperventilating. My body is still clearly moving through this experience of being caught in this riptide, though I was in complete peace in my being. And so at this point, I'm not even sure if I'm alive or dead. The experience I'm having is so clearly different from my normal everyday experience. So I go sit on my towel on the beach and I grab a handful of sand and I'm thinking, okay, I can feel the sand. So I'm guessing I'm still alive. And I remember thinking at that point, like, this seems really interesting. I feel like I should be, from this very traumatic experience, like a little bit upset about it at all. I was really just in this state of just complete peace and love. It was quite exceptional. And so at this point, I needed to get myself back. I was meeting my sister and we're going to leave. And I had to take a little boat. I was actually on another little smaller island where I was having my swim. And on the boat, the two women that were on the beach were also taking that boat back. And I was talking with one of the women, and she was a scientist there studying this leaf eater ant with the Smithsonian. And I was talking about her project with her, and I remember something distinct about that experience, which was that as we were speaking, I had tremendous clarity about her science and her modality. It was what we were speaking as if we were colleagues. And I remember noticing that this was a bit different. I studied a little bit of science at university, but I don't have a degree in science, so I noticed that I somehow had this extremely heightened sensory awareness of, almost felt like this state of omniscience where I had tapped into some, the Akasha or something that has contained within it all knowledge that I somehow in this expanded awareness was able to easily sort of partake. So we get back to the other little island where I was going to meet my sister. And so I'm sitting in a restaurant. And at this point, by now, I'm beginning to really sort of notice that the state that I'm in is clearly different. It's different from, obviously my everyday safe being. And I'm beginning to wonder, what's going on? What is this? And right as I begin to really inquire, I simultaneously kind of hear and look up into the sky, and I see this enormous portal. And from this portal comes this very, it was kind of like a booming, but it wasn't loud. It was just this very loud, not loud, but like male voice that said, "It just is." Thought said me, that doesn't even stop making sense. And then as I'm thinking that, this voice says it again, "It just is." And in that moment, it became completely clear what that meant. But after the experience of this incredibly open, expanded state, which lasted about a month, actually, after this event in the ocean, it took me a long time to get to that place of understanding of what that means, because of course it's a huge paradox for us in this reality. And so anyway, as I'm sitting there in this restaurant, I'm just being, for lack of a better word, just downloaded with tremendous amounts of information. I was trying to write it down. I couldn't even keep up. And so I started speaking into my phone. It was coming in that quickly and in so much. And I noticed also, this is another really interesting aspect of this expanded state of awareness, is that where I was sitting, where I was a pretty touristic area. There were a lot of families that were passing by the restaurant. And it felt like, for lack of a better way to describe it, that they were behind some big, thick piece of plexiglass. It was like I could see them very, very clearly, but I couldn't feel them. It was like they were just mentally not there in the present reality. And I remember thinking, it was kind of disturbing, to be honest. And at the same time that I was noticing this kind of lack of presence, I could see so clearly familial and from our lineage that are just passed on, like the children were just literally mimicking the exact same patterns as the parents. And then it became very clear to me how the dis-ease process moves through our body and how it's really metamorphic and epigenetic, and that our bodies are actually quite clear, and that these patterns move in from a broader field and move through our form kind of as we're exposed to them, through our families or people that we spend a lot of time with, our lineage. And so they're really just kind of broader patterns that we take in as innately really just here.
That sounds amazing and incredibly interesting. There's so many things that I want to follow up on in there. But I think, first of all, I would wonder when you were able to see these people, as almost like disconnected from you, like there was a difference between you and them. And of course, I can imagine it felt strange. It felt weird. It felt like something you didn't feel before. But with the knowledge and vocabulary that you have today, what was happening? Were you in different states of consciousness? What were you picking up on from those people?
Yeah, I'm glad that you acknowledged that, because this NDE happened 20 years ago. And so, of course, there's been a tremendous understanding that has developed from that time. And what I now know is that I was what is sort of termed present in our sort of spiritual speak of the day, attuned to the all, I guess you could say, or the whole, or all that is. And what I was noticing or picking up on was the mental disconnect that we're basically all overlaid with in our, as a humanity, really, to some degree or not. But almost every human has this overlay. And I was just noticing how much this overlay takes our essence away from our physical embodiment. And it was very disturbing. And now I understand what that was. But at the time, I didn't have any language for it. I didn't have any.
And how could we prevent it? Because it almost seems to me like this disconnect is sort of happening, I think, because of the world that we live in, right? We tend to run towards a million places. We tend to be really present, mostly with our phones and not really with the people around us. We tend to chase things like cars and money and houses instead of being well and being happy. We're caring about developing and growing spiritually. So it always seems like this numbness that's in our society. Is this also how you define this disconnect? And what can we do to remove ourselves from it?
Yeah, so So really now my understanding of it is that it's has a root that goes very, very far back. So, we could use the term modernity now, like speaking about technology and our modern lifestyles. But in actuality, this is a paradigm, a divisive paradigm that has been overlaying humanity, the essence, the true nature of humanity for a very, very long time. One could even take it back potentially to the notion of another civilization that existed before this humanity came about, the time of Atlantis and their technology. And so the way I would see it is that there is this divisive polarization that comes in somehow into our true nature, how it's, there are a lot of theories about how and why it's overlaying our essential self, but the fact is that it is. And it's really this very deeply rooted paradigm. I would express it as duality, as separation, essentially the notion that we are a persona and that somehow we're outside of the rest of everything. And of course, this is a complete fallacy. It's not at all the true nature of our being. And the state that I was in after coming out of the ocean was basically the true state, the original state, I believe, of our humanity and of our not just humanity, but of our natural being. We express it as humanity. Other living beings express it as their form. But the notion of separation, which has, I think been around a long, long time, I feel is at the root of it. And then from there, of course, it just builds into complexity. And then modernity has really served as a divisive tool to take us from what I believe are native or indigenous selves. And there are still some humans on this planet who are not corrupted by this notion of separation, but few and far between.
I do feel like increasingly more of us are trying to look for answers, are trying to raise our vibration, are starting to be more interested in just things that are good for the soul.
Yeah, and I think I call it an expression, you could call it the work that emerged from this first, I've had 2 NDEs, but from the first one, this very deep inquiry emerged, if you can imagine, thinking, what was that exactly? A lot of NDE experiencers have this state while they're sort of crossed over or in, the other dimension. I had it as awakened. And so, of course, it sparked tremendous inquiry. And as a result, I've been able to tap into some, what I would consider universal principles, feminine principles, the return of feminine, basically just returning us to a state of being holistic and original again. And so, for example, one of your questions about how to return, I call it reorient, essentially reorient ourselves into this natural, original state. For example, the notion of bilateral symmetry in our physical body is a dualistic, artificial concept. One of those seed concepts that I speak about that has divested us from our embodied form. So we're really, radial is curved and holistic. And we've been fed this notion that we're bilateral, that we can be divided. And so it has set up this very divisive dissonance between our senses and our cognition. So our senses, of course, are functioning in a fully 360-degree spherical environment. You can look at the cochlea in the inner ear, which is essentially a spiral, and it gauges our proprioception. So it's very clear that we're physically 360 degrees, and yet we're peripheralizing our senses to what we call sides, to the edges of our form. And the truth is that we originate through a center. We're of radial symmetry, as are all living beings in 3 dimensions. That's just the nature. And so reorienting the embodied form in a sensory way, I think, is one of the ways to purge this very divisive duality structure. Because of course it changes perspective, and the perspective is a dimensional shift. So our bodies exist in this three-dimensional holistic state, but our minds have been forced to function in duality. And so there's this underlying dissonance that is rattling us in a sensory way. And it's creating this, you could call it a static or a lack of clarity. I call it a lack of orientation. It's taking us from being oriented. And when you're oriented in a 360-degree way through your physical form, that moves through the mental body in the same way. And so you end up having a dimensional shift of perspective. And then these divisive tools aren't as attractive. In fact, they become quite repulsive. And like for me, living in a modern culture is absolutely repulsive. I want nothing to do with it. It's so dissonant and disturbing to me. And I understand a lot of people are, they have to do that. That's just sort of what's happening in their way. But there are embodied principles that we can begin moving through that will reharmonize and reclarify and recohere our physical form, our sensory body, our mental body, and our spiritual self, and bring them back into coherence.
So what are these practices? How do we even start?
Yeah, well, radial symmetry is one, which is, of course, paradox, because we've been taught to think of ourselves as sides. And so returning to the notion of orienting through centrality. And so, for example, if you're just standing, if you just imagine a vortice moving right through the center of your trunk, and so you feel yourself as 360 degrees form, as spherical, as, part of this 360 degree environment. Start really sensing all the way around and through the body. And it really begins. So the thing is, we don't have to teach our body or our mind this. This is an organic, natural state. And so once we begin having the clarity and returning to this, for example, just this radial symmetry, the body is reflexive and reflective, and it will inherently begin to return also through the physical state of radial symmetry. So we really don't have to do much, but part of my work is teaching people how to begin to reorient their body through this radial dynamic. Yeah, so there are some techniques that I teach for it, but yeah, just sensing yourself as having a central vortice and being 360 degrees. And if you look at your body, it's completely clear. There's nothing flat. There's not a straight line. There's not an angle or a plane. Those are all completely artifice. That's just artificial math that's been put upon our body so that it can be plotted and graphed. It's not the reality.
It also mentioned disease and how the body is in itself perfect and it's not in a state of disease, or there's nothing essentially wrong with it. But when we are so disconnected, right, like we are picking up things that then manifest, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that manifest into ailments or diseases. So could you tell me more about your view on why disease happens? And how should we make sense of it?
Right. Well, again, to go back to very, very deep roots of separation. And so the notion of separation, of course, brings pain and dissonance through the physical body, through our essence, because it is a fallacy. And so that in and of itself is dissonant. On this notion of separation, we start taking on roles and identities. And then, of course, our true nature doesn't really adhere or isn't necessarily coherent with these roles and identities. And so again, more dissonance from our true nature. And so it starts setting up dissonance within the fields. And of course, that gets passed on through lineage, expectations. You're not fulfilling your role. This is the role that you're expected to fulfill. This is the identity you're expected to have. And some people are very comfortable with that. And that's lovely and wonderful. But many of us, dare I say, most of us, really might have other notions about how we want to be, what our true self is yearning for. Huge tapestry of alchemy that is continual origination, continual inspiration. And when that gets suppressed constantly and repressed, it starts to really set up a dissonance in the energy field, which of course then moves through the material form and creates like a drag, literally a drag on the system. It can manifest in a myriad of different ways. And nothing's perfect and no one's perfect. And, I've gone through my things as well. We're all moving through this together. I don't want to make it sound like we have some perfect state that we need to aspire to. That's not at all what it's about. It's really about all of us coming together as a humanity to begin to understand and explore and inquire into this greater expanded way, which is really the message I want to put forth. It's not some goal we need to achieve at all. It's really part of our natural essence. It's really just us discovering this new way, this, new paradigm that's upon us.
That sounds so beautiful. And it's so far away, right, from today's society, where it's exactly that we need a goal. We need like a 5-year plan. We need KPIs to keep us on track. And here you're saying our essence is not that at all.
No, right. It's right here, right now. Yeah. It's what is.
I think that it makes it even more difficult to accept, right? Because everything we've created, say deadlines, meetings, all of those things, we've made ourselves. They're man-made constructs. There's really not much to it. So it's very different when you view it through the paradigm of I can subscribe to a deadline or I could not, because it's not quite a lion in the savannah threatening to eat you and then you have to run. But you could just say, well, I'm not going to let this one thing stress me out and I'm not going to subscribe to that. Feels different thinking about it that way.
Yes, right. And that's kind of the point I was maybe not making so well earlier, is that the paradigm shift, kind of embracing the paradox of it just is, which is a tremendous paradox, but the willingness you were asking about, what we can do and being willing to embrace these paradoxical notions is tremendously beneficial in sort of beginning this pulsation into this totality, this notion beyond separation.
How did your life change after this NDE? So how did that change who Seba was before that experience?
Well, I, truth be told, was born a little bit different. So I came into this world quite different. I already had what would be, I guess, considered a very expanded perspective or paradigm. But of course, as a child, I didn't understand this at all. For example, I saw everyone as a light being, and I had no idea other people did not see that way. And so, for example, one of the difficulties that arose as a result of that is that I could see very clearly the dissonance between people trying to fulfill roles and identities that weren't true to them, that weren't part of their true nature, and who they were holistically. And for a kid, it was very terrifying because they looked like they appeared that they were lying and they weren't being truthful. World, you think they have total integrity. You just assume they have integrity. And when you can see this dissonance, it's very frightening. And so it created tremendous anxiety. And so I was always trying to fit in, and yet in this incredible state of anxiety, knowing that this wasn't the truth of the reality. But I fought really hard to fit in because I didn't understand at all what was happening. And I thought it was completely me. I thought something was wrong with me for a very, very long time. So I kind of went along with the play, if you will. I kind of adapted these roles and identities, and they were never comfortable. In fact, they created tremendous pain in my being. And so basically, by the time this NDE happened, I broke completely away and just decided to live as my true self. And no longer was I going to try to fit into any kind of role or identity in society in that way ever again. It just became so clear that it wasn't going to be possible for me anymore to even try to pretend to fit in. And so I already had a lot of, high degree of telepathy and all of these attributes. And really, we all do. Again, I don't want to set myself apart. I don't want to claim any sort of authority or knowing. Essentially, we're all just being overlain by this root separation paradigm that is creating a dissonance, which is taking us away from our true nature, which encompasses these abilities. These are very natural human abilities. Animals have them. Of course, we're animals, but other animals use them all the time. And, we too are highly telepathic, every single one of us. This is who we all are. This is our true nature. And because I arrived here in such a heightened state of awareness or expanded awareness, I utilized them quite easily. And then, of course, after the NDE, I just began freely using them without feeling like I needed to explain myself.
So that sounds like quite a liberation, right? From trying to fit into this social construct, man-made box, to finally accepting what your inner self was saying all along that you should be.
Absolutely. It didn't come without pain and struggle. I want to be clear about that as well. And especially because I know now a lot of people are beginning to become more aware of this true nature. And as the separation paradigm is beginning to be questioned by more and more people, and these roles and identities are being broken through, it can create a little bit of isolation. And, we have to move away sometimes from groups of people that we've been associated with. It can happen that way. And so it can come with a little bit of, there can be some growing pains as part of that. So it's not all of this, it's not idyllic necessarily, but it's essential. For me anyway, it's essential. I can't play the game anymore because I realize that can create a lot of problems for me.
I can imagine. And I tend to always say that the universe or whoever just nudges you in the right direction. And usually when you avoid challenges, you avoid going through the growing pains, you're just being pushed in that direction. Initially, the pushes are quite gentle, right? But the more you resist it, they stop being gentle and you're just being shoved towards where you need to go.
Especially when the awareness lies through us. There are people for whom this notion of this current reality is very comfortable. And so there might not be that kind of dissonance. But for those of us for whom these questions are beginning to arise, and this sort of feeling of something's not quite right, or there's something more, but I have no idea what that is, then those growing pains come about. And the persona, of course, wants to fight, and it wants to overlay the natural self, and wants to overlay the inspiration and the impulsive being that's moving through that. And so there can be this real struggle between emerging and wanting to fit in and merging with the current culture.
And tell me about your second near-death experience. How did that come about?
So the second one happened maybe about 2 years later. I was living up in the mountains and I had gone on a hike, and I didn't intend to be out the whole day, but I stayed out the whole day. And I didn't bring much to eat or drink with me, and I was really bundled up. I was at 8,000 feet, so it was kind of cold, and it was a wet day also. So I was living in a little cabin, and I got back to this cabin at the end of the day, and I was pretty wet and cold. And my boyfriend made a big fire. We lived in this little cabin that had a big hearth because it was the only way to heat the place. So I sat there, and I had a bunch of wool on, and it was wet, it was damp, and I was just feeling cold. And so I didn't take anything off. I just kind of kept all my layers on. And this big fire was going, and I felt really great, actually. I didn't feel overheated at all. I felt very ambient. And so I didn't really take anything off. It didn't feel like I needed to. And I don't know how long I was there, maybe a couple of hours. My boyfriend and I were just chatting, and then he went into the kitchen to make dinner. And as he was in there, all of a sudden, it feels like it really came out of the blue and happened really fast. I started to feel physically terrible. It was really strange, and it felt very ominous. It didn't feel like I feel a little bad or a little, like a little bit down. It felt like, wow, something terrible is happening to my body. And there was a little couch kind of off to one side. It was just a one-room little cabin. And I thought, I'm going to go lay down on that couch. And then this kind of same voice that emerged through me from the ocean came through. And this voice said, if you go lay on that couch, you're not going to get up, with the clear meaning of you're going to die. And at this point, I thought, oh, this is really, I don't know what's happening, but it's very serious and it's very bad. And so there was a table and a couple of chairs across the room near my boyfriend who was cooking. And I thought, just got to get over there and get his attention. So I just kind of stumbled across the room, and I got into this chair, and I told him, I said, I'm going to faint. And he looked over to me at that point. He was like, I could see on his face, like, I didn't look very good, obviously. And he comes over and he feels my back, and he's like, my God, you're burning up. And so I learned later, I guess, that wool really traps heat. I guess that's the reason people love wool, is that it keeps in body heat. And as I'd been sitting there by the fire, I must have basically just been becoming extremely dehydrated. So I don't know if it was a combination of dehydration, heat stroke, I'm not sure. But whatever it was quite serious, and I could tell that I was going to lose consciousness. And it felt like I wasn't just going to faint. It felt like something very, very ominous was about to happen. And so I started pulling all my layers off, and I asked him for some water and some honey just to try to keep myself conscious. I was really scared at that point, and I just did not want to lose consciousness. And he comes and stands in front of me, and after I, had the water and the honey, and it was still going, that, everything was kind of closing in and getting dark. He's like, don't worry, if you faint, I'm going to catch you. And that's, as far as I know, the last thing. Everything just got really dark. And, he had a totally different experience with my body than I had. So the next thing I know, I was spinning completely out of control. I mean, just like, the only way I describe it is, the film Gravity, where the Sandra Bullock character she gets disconnected from her ship and she's just wildly spinning. That's what it felt like. And I just couldn't get oriented. And I don't remember having a form. It didn't seem like I had a body, but I had the sense of disorientation, that I wanted to be oriented. And as I'm moving, I was flying like warp speed in this spinning grid, just very distinct grid structure. It was very brightly colored. I would call it neon, but it was way brighter than what we would see as neon here. And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, what's happening? Where am I? What is going on? It was really scary. I was pretty terrified. I was deeply confused. I just could not imagine what was going on. And I later came to understand that the grid was a tesseract, a fourth dimensional form or shape that I was moving through as I was moving dimensionally out of this three-dimensional paradigm and expanding into the greater whole. And then suddenly I was able to orient, and I was through this grid, and I arrive in this just inky, black, velvety, rich environment. I felt completely tranquil again, had that feeling of just profound peace, like peace that with these psyches, I don't think we can come to, and just this, again, this very ubiquitous, transcendental love. And I just remember thinking the space itself, which it wasn't contained at all. And in fact, I had the sense of it being infinite. I mean, just total infinite space. But I felt very cocooned, very insulated, very, very warm, very safe. It just was very soft and loving. And then I also noticed that the essence of the space was very sentient. I could tell clearly that there was sentience within the essence of the space. And I remember being a little bit surprised by that, because you would think that this just inky blackness would just be cold and void, but it was the opposite, which I know sounds a little bit strange, but it was the opposite. It's really interesting. And then the next thing I know, I'm just and I become aware of three huge beings. And I remember, it's strange because I don't remember having or not having a body, but I'm pretty sure I did not have form. But I remember having to look up at them. And we're having this pretty intense conversation. It wasn't, I don't feel like I was being scolded, or there wasn't, it was pretty neutral on their part, but it felt very firm, sort of very much like kind of a guidance situation. And I felt on the receiving end of it. And then as we are speaking, I hear this, for lack of a better way to describe it, it was just a sound as I understood it then. And I don't know if you know the Charlie Brown character in the US. It's a cartoon, and when the adults would call, they would have this wah, wah, wah sound on the phone. Well, that's exactly kind of what it sounded like, this jumbled sort of sound. And as I kind of oriented my focus toward it, at the time I was experiencing this, it wasn't clear what I was seeing, but in recall, I could see clearly that it was our planet. It was the Earth. And I could see this brilliant blue and this inky black background. It was like so beautiful. And I could see the white atmosphere around it, but I didn't note anything significant about that in that moment. And I turned again, and the beings and I heard the same sort of sound again. I turn and focus, I see the planet, I turn again to them. And then on the third time, I hear this sound, but it's clearly Seba, but I don't register it as me. At this point, there wasn't a persona. I didn't have any notion of who I was or how I'd gotten there. There's just nothing about the Seba person involved in that. But as I heard that name being called, again, I'm just moving warp speed. And as I'm coming back, I see this, what I now know was my body. And I didn't identify it as that at the time. And then the next thing I know, I'm seeing backs of eyelids, which of course still no notion of what that was in this moment. And then suddenly of course, was my boyfriend, and he was very close to me, and I could see in the eyes in particular that there was tremendous distress. And I remember thinking, wow, this being is very upset, but I still had no notion of being a person, of this person being a person. It was just, again, this sort of allness or wholeness or completeness. It's just so difficult, so hard to describe it. And again, I'm feeling really disoriented. I'm thinking, and where am I now? What is going on? And so I said, where am I? And he said, you're at home. And I thought, okay, I don't know what that means, but that seems very connected for him. And then he says, how do you feel? And I said, perfect. And I know that seems like a really strange way to describe how you feel, but at the time, I felt like I was still cocooned in that space, in that very beautiful place. I felt warm. It wasn't even like I could feel a body per se, but I just felt very wonderful. I felt very peaceful. Everything felt really great. I felt like I wasn't even touching the floor, in fact, which I soon realized I was laying on the floor. And what's notable about that is that it would normally have been very cold because I'm on this cement floor in this cabin at 8,000 feet, just down to my tank top. And I didn't even know I was on a floor. And so clearly there was still the essence of this expanded state, or, you could call it another place. Of course, that doesn't really exist. The next thing I said was, I want to sit up. And he said, are you sure? And I remember being really surprised by that. And of course, why would that be weird? Having no notion of what had just happened. And he starts to help me, and I'm thinking, why are you helping me? I can do this. And as I sit up, I realize, and yeah, the body doesn't really feel like coherent and mobile. I felt completely wonderful, but I could tell there was, something not quite animating about it. And I look down and I see my hands, and they are in this state that you see of people who've gone through like some sort of neurological episode. They kind of curled up. And I remember thinking that was very weird and being really surprised by that. And as I'm continuing to sit up, I was looking down at this form, and it looked really like a dead body. I mean, there was no animation. My feet were splayed way out to the sides. Like there just wasn't any tone, any muscular tone. It looked like there was no essence. And then as I continued to sit up, it was kind of like the animation or my essence re-entered the body as I began to sit up. And I still felt really great. And then I got myself standing, and I had tons of nothing at all had happened to my body. But then, of course, he explained, because at this point I can tell, I'm on the floor, he's looking terrified, and I could tell obviously something had happened. And he told me that I'd had a grand mal seizure after I had lost consciousness. And then I basically fell to the floor, and he said, I just died. He said my eyes stopped tracking. They went different directions. I couldn't feel a pulse. I wasn't breathing, couldn't feel a heartbeat. And then he said, I was just looking at him. He said he called my name, obviously, the 3 times he called my name. And then he said, I was just there again. It was like no transition. It just appeared suddenly. And then he said something which I find also very noteworthy and significant, which is that he called it salon fresh. And he said that when I was just there again, it looked like I was lit from the inside. He's like, you looked like you had 360-degree lighting, and you looked like you were about 20 years old. And at the time, I was like 48. So this is definitely, a change in my appearance, I would say. And, obviously it didn't last, but I just found that to be very interesting. And again, back to what I came to understand from the first NDEs, that this is really very fluid, and it's only this construct of separation that keeps this essence from being really naturally expressed at all times. And that age is just a construct. It's just a learned construct passed down in the lineage, and that our body just takes it on, and that it's really not naturally expressed through our original essence. And so I just thought that was incredibly interesting. And then, we talked about it again, to sob, and, this is how I knew he was really being truthful about it. I mean, he was just in a state of, incredible dismay about it. And it was very, very interesting experience.
Wow, that sounds quite. You had a positive experience, right? But it was terrifying for him.
My heart really broke for him. I can't imagine what it would be like to have someone die through a traumatic event in your presence. It would be horrible. And I really felt for him. But yeah, on my side, I never, I didn't feel anything traumatic in the body at all. My essence had already left the body. I believe even from the grand mal seizure, I was already being transported through dimensional perspective. Yeah.
Why do you think you came back?
I guess the obvious answer would be that I felt like I wanted to be in this reality to put forth what I had come to understand and now what was being really reinforced. I'd been kind of hiding from it, to be honest. I knew that I was supposed to be putting it forward, but at the time it felt pretty strange and extraordinary. Now there's so much more acceptance. I mean, now we see so many people are speaking about their NDEs, and there's so much more willingness to embrace paranormal and metaphysical experiences. And I had been kind of tiptoeing around it and tiptoeing around putting my work out there because it just, I don't know, I felt really vulnerable. And then I think that second NDE was, I think the beings were kind of saying, okay, it's time. And I think that's part of the alchemy of our human readiness as well. I think humanity might have called me back. Who knows? It's completely interconnected. It's completely interwoven. So I also believe that it's part of just the alchemy of what wanted to be birthed from all of us as well. So might not have just been my decision. It might have been our collective decision to have this work brought forth in this expression.
Beautiful. And it does sound like, first of all, the first NDE changed you and changed your path a lot, but it almost sounds like you needed to have the second one to sort of remind you and steer you more into that direction.
I think so. I know that I was definitely being hesitant about putting the work forward. And, I had this concern of not appearing professional. And at the time, which would have been 20 years ago from the first NDE, you weren't considered a professional person if you were talking about metaphysical experiences. And again, I'm trying to fit in this role identity and, put forth this essence. And it, really was difficult I could leave society myself as a person, but then to put the work forward and the expression forward felt a little bit intimidating. And I think that the second NDE was sort of like, okay, it's time. It's time.
Seba, how can people connect with your work and with you if they want to?
So I have website of the Tao, T-A-U, of equipoise, Tao of equipoise. And then I also have a YouTube channel with the same handle, Tao of equipoise. I put forth a lot of videos there, but through the website as well. I have Instagram, the kind of the usual social media channels.
But